Very good. So, good afternoon again. Thank you for waiting. This will be exciting today because it's smart mobility. And just a reminder from last time, the tiny mobility you have within a building for fire escape and the things we talked about, security and safety in a building, in a city, and in a country. This is the topic of last week, smart security, smart safety. And this time, it is smart mobility. The whole story so far, we had over the semester livability, security, and now mobility in the last 3 lectures. And you will see they are somehow linked to each other. If you remember the big stocks and flows diagram that I showed a few lectures ago, this mobility would touch on many of these stocks and flows in the city, but particularly on 3. On the small scale and the building scale, of course, everything that has to do with low exergy is possible, or even better possible, for a building if you consider mobility, a new kind of smart mobility, as we will see later. And then on the medium scale, on the urban scale, on the neighborhood scale, urban design strategies and resources, that is very much influencing mobility, person mobility, because if you make a city walkable or not, decides how much CO2 and other greenhouse gases you generate. Just as an aside, I think last week or last month, for the first time in the city of Copenhagen, maybe you will mention that as well, the number of people coming into the city with bicycle has exceeded the number of people coming in with cars for the first time ever. And then on the large scale, mobility moving between cities and city and countryside, of course, this is the mobility and transportation planning module of the Future Cities Lab that Alex Erhard was actually leading in the first Future Cities laboratory. And on the simulation platform, which visualized some of these architectural features, we could work together in the past. These types of mobility here we will probably not talk so much about today, but remember also this mobility or transportation coming into a country, going out of a country is an important landing point for mobility, particularly in states and cities that are underwater. But now to our guest from today. He is leading the research project on engaging mobility, it's called, in our Future Cities laboratory in the Responsive Cities module or scenario. Before that, he has coordinated Future Cities Lab's research group on mobility and transportation planning. And in this role, he has led the implementation and further development of the large-scale agent-based transport demand model MATSEM, Singapore. He obtained a PhD here from ETH in 2011. And he has also gotten an award, this is always important, the Organization of Swiss Road and Transport Professionals. Yes, but 11 years ago. But it was the best Master of Science thesis on the value of travel times, savings, and location choice for shopping trips. So that seemed to have to be always a problem, and still is. But in between, the current research that focuses on bridging the gap between transportation modeling and urban design, and this is exactly our topic here, and the planning for an active mobility. His vision is to replace the current approach of separated, only periodically updated urban datasets with living digital urban model, where datasets are continuously updated and statistically enriched. So that's his present research, and now we'll see done with it.
Exactly on those 2 topics that you mentioned last in the introduction. Okay. Which are essentially 2 topics I'm going to present on today. Those 2 topics are inspired by those 2 claims, so that I want to work at the interface of urban design and transport planning, which means like small scale. And then the idea of a living data system of an entire city, which means large scale big data modeling. And I'm going to present to you two case studies, like research projects that we are currently working on in Singapore that, well, you can say it's smart mobility because any future mobility also must be smart, but it's not that particularly focusing on like smart mobility. If you imagine like car sharing and everything, mobility as a service on demand on your smartphone, this is what everybody thinks of smart mobility these days. But I think it's also a bit a trend. So the research we are pushing forward in Singapore is not exactly on this, maybe in this wider environment of smart mobility. But I will come to that in a moment. First, I would like to pick up the idea of how transport and mobility relates to the idea of stocks and flows. Now, cities can obviously be understood as a complex systems where you have rather rigid stocks such as streets, street networks, buildings, and so on. So if you think about the innovation cycle of buildings and streets, it's pretty long. If you take, for example, Champs-Élysées, it's where it is for the last 400 years almost. Obviously, over time, as the stocks change, as means of technology change, when this street was being laid, there was no car. There were a few horse carriages, but the street is still the same. It's still leading from the Louvre out of town northwest. Now, today to Arc de Triomphe, before that was not there. So it was like a rural road. And over time, that road got readapted over and over again. So in the beginning, it was like a road for doing a Sunday promenade, where you would go for a leisurely walk. And today is obviously a bustling major throughway, bustling with businesses along it, a very wide sidewalk, but that hasn't always been like this. And it's exactly this idea that Champs-Élysées kind of stands for, is that you have on the one side the hard stocks and then the more moving flows, and is essentially how you design those stocks or redesign, adapt them to the constant involvement of the technology, how this comes together, which then defines how your flows are being organized in your city. So Champs-Élysées as it is today is actually only about 15 years old in this configuration. Before it was a proper boulevard, and the boulevard, as you know, has like a major thoroughway in the middle, and then access lanes like left and right in just one direction on both sides of the road. So where you see that cars are being parked at the moment, and that's also was a surprise to me that you still can park your car on Champs-Élysées, such a precious space. If you think about the rents that you pay for there and then how much you pay for the car being parked on Champs-Élysées, there's a big difference. I mean, if you park your car and you pay $20 a day or euro, you think it's a lot. But if you need to rent for 20 or the amount of 12 square meters for $30 a day in Champs-Élysées, you would be very happy if you can get such a low rent. So huge differences. And this idea of designing and also kind of marketing or pricing space that mitigates the idea of stocks and flows. So in this configuration, since about 15 years before, we had the access lane, so cars were passing by and you could hop out of the car, maybe even park there. I have actually 2 lanes of parking. So at some point, the city of Paris decided it's actually better to have the pedestrians, to provide more space to the pedestrians. And it's actually a meaningful choice, because if you go and count the number of pedestrians that pass by every day and the amount of cars, the pedestrians is like 3 or 4 times more, certainly. Maybe that would be even more if you even widen the footway or footpath. So it's also something that you realize, once you widen the footpath, there is more pedestrians. You can't really know where they're coming from, but it's some switch from car to pedestrians, just how you mitigate or design your streets. So you influence behavior through designing your streets. And this is something that caught my attention, and as I had the opportunity to draft a rather big project in Singapore, I thought, well, in Singapore, it must be on bicycles, because bicycles in Singapore is a tiny share, mode share of about 1%. Zurich has about 6 or 7. So there's a huge potential for Singapore to cycle more. But then it's a question again about design. And there we are at the interface of urban design and transport planning. The second point is about space. And space is a key driver for mobility. What we have here is a very simple case study example of 5 different types of streets. The street on the very left is all cars. Then we have a bus lane, we have a lane for trams, and we have bicycles, and we have pedestrians. Now, as you will see in the video that I will just start, the width of the street, or these individual lanes, coincidence. It assumes that how much space you actually need to bring over the same period of time 200 people through. So now 200 people you can either squeeze like this as pedestrians, give them a bit more room, then they can cycle, or you put them also sort of squeeze, but you don't actually realize that much, in a tram, in a bus, or then graciously in cars. Now cars, many people were thinking about big technology, autonomous vehicles, everything will be cars in the future. I say no, because we have the issue of geometry in cities. There is not endless space, and so we need to plan for it. And obviously, future autonomous vehicles might be able to have more narrow roads as they are autonomous, so the safety margin can be less. They can maybe operate in platoons, but still they require quite much space for how many passengers they carry. So if I start the video, you will see that they did that well in spacing the width. And so now we realize how much space and time it needs to actually move 200 people across like a given cross-section. So all through, bam, finished. And it's just amazing how much the different space requirements differ. And now you might say, why is this guy keen on this one? Bicycle needs so much space. Yes, true. Certainly as compared to public transport and the pedestrians. But cycling has a couple of other advantages, and public transport has a couple of disadvantages, and I think you can really link them up very well. So with public transport that is really efficient, you need rather wider stop distances. So from stop to stop, depending on like the carriage size, but also how fast you can go. You go in Zurich like 200 meters, which I think is way too short. It dates back from like another age, because obviously Zurich got denser, and if it's denser, actually you can have wider stop to stop and still have the same amount of people kind of going to being attached to one bus stop. And the bigger the city is, the faster you need to have public transport. So in a big city, you have MRT trains, you have S-Bahnen, so you can consider Canton of Zurich also as a city. It's just very, it's not very dense, but in the sense that you can go from Hinwil to the Hauptbahnhof in half an hour. This is a city for me. For me, a city is defined as where can I go, like half an hour, 1 hour. And then in that sense, also Basel and Zurich is one city, as we have, you probably also have read in a couple of those publications by Herzog and Dömeron. There is this idea that you have the whole city, Switzerland as a city. So if you take that, and then you have the fast speed of public transport, you need something else. And there the bicycle comes in. And there you're not that much anymore constrained by the space. Like for the capillary fine granularity distribution from the major transport hubs, like a Hauptbahnhof or Oerlikon, those public transport hubs, then to reach your last mile, a mile is 1.6 kilometers, or last 2 miles, I think bicycles have a huge advantage and need to be leveraged more. As Gerhard mentioned, there are other cities, such as Copenhagen, who have done a much better job in supporting and designing streets for bicycles. And there you really can see it. Depending on how comfortable and safe you design your streets, it really directly impacts your bicycle mode share. So that was kind of the introduction. Why it doesn't switch anymore? Now it does. Coming to the research, yes,
Just
one question.
Quick question. How well is it working that the people automatically come if you build the infrastructure for them? Because I think like I was in Milano shortly. I think they had like huge and very well engineered infrastructure for bikes and like separated lanes and everything, but I didn't see a single bicycle.
Yes, I think the infrastructure itself is not enough. And the other problem is also where you put this infrastructure. We know that you can consider cycling infrastructure as a weakest link problem. So even though you have like wonderful infrastructure across an origin and destination relation, if there is one weak link where people consider it as unsafe or uncomfortable, they just would not consider. Time is another factor. It gradually needs time. We know that people have habits in mobility decision making. So once you have decided for one mode of transport, normally you only reconsider if something big happens. Either you move or you need to acquire a car because you have now a holiday home or your family grew or whatsoever. Then we can observe those shifts in mobility behavior. So it needs time as well. And it needs something of what we call mobility culture. It has to do with education. And again, this also takes time that your friends are influencing you. Like if your friend is cycling, then you maybe hop on one of those bicycles. Many people in Milano, I could imagine, do not even own a bicycle, so they need to go and buy one. So it's gradual processes. Any more questions? If not, I would continue. So what we do in Singapore is we really have, or as I consider it, more not only a lab, but it's a research platform within this big future cities laboratory, which we call Engaging Mobility. And this Engaging Mobility research platform engages various kinds of technology, but also methodologies to address pressing or interesting research questions of today and the future of mobility in cities. What I'm going to do today is to tell about the lower side, about one big data project that we have done, about a virtual reality project that we are doing at the moment, and those engage simulation and are both open source projects. Community and stakeholders, I think is an incredibly important aspect of a smart city, although often forgotten, because if you have this idea of a smart city that's completely full of sensors and apps and so on, what tends to be forgotten is the people who actually are going to use those apps. So what are their requirements? What are their needs? And often this is an afterthought. I mean, some of you have seen like the smart lamp post that has sensors for humidity and temperature and wind speed, maybe acts as a Wi-Fi antenna and so on. But this concept lacks so many problems. First and foremost, who owns this lamp post? Well, one department in the city that's not connected to the department that runs the communication platforms, which the Wi-Fi will be, that's not connected to the meteorological service, and maybe the meteorological service actually doesn't need their a wind meter and so on. So all those concepts did not work, and we know this by now, and the industry will realize soon as well. So it's really the question, what are the problems, and how can we address those problems in a people-centric way? And there, obviously, the community and stakeholder engagement is key to understand those problems, and in the design process to reiterate your design solutions, get feedback from the people about what you plan for them, and then actually improve as compared to put out a lamppost and then hope the fabulous entrepreneurs of the 21st century that can program will find a smart way of using those sensors to serve people's needs. I think that concept needs to be reconsidered. Okay, so much to community and stakeholders, now focusing on those two technologies, virtual reality and big data. So the first project is what we call engaging active mobility, and it's all concerns about the design for bicyclists in Singapore. And at the moment we have, as said, about 1% of people cycling in Singapore, and there are good reasons for it. One is it's terribly hot and humid. And many see this as the one and only reason that people are not cycling. And then obviously it's a bit fatalistic. You say, well, then we can't do anything. It's hot and humid. But that's the wrong approach, as you will see, and as I will demonstrate here. So this is one of the most lively neighborhoods, a typical street, Serangoon Road in Little India. And you see the shops are vibrate or bustling out with their produce and what they want to sell. And then the street takes so much space, there is so little space for pedestrians. And then for cyclists, there is no proper cycling path, not even a demarcated cycling lane, nothing. Still, a few people are cycling, but you wait actually quite some time till you get a chance to take a picture with the cyclist. Then this is in the old part. In the newer part of the city, you have like streets that really bring you somewhere because there is a highly hierarchical network. So whenever you want to go more than 1 kilometer, you will end up on a street where Rosengarten is really like a small street against it if you compare it. So it's like 6 to 8 lanes, so 4 in both directions. And every 800 meters or so, you have a huge intersection where obviously 6 lanes meet each other, and only the braver people in this world are dare enough to actually cross it on a bicycle. So those people who still want to cycle, such as this uncle here, an uncle is an elderly person in Singapore, they normally cycle then in the newer parts of the city on the sidewalk. And this obviously comes with a lot of conflicts. So on the sidewalks, there are the pedestrians who go from and to the bus stop and the MRT station. And so those footpaths are about 1.8, 2 meters wide. So you can pass a pedestrian, but if some other pedestrian is actually coming in the other direction, which quite often happens because there's a lot of public transport, it's not a very convenient way of cycling, especially in a hot and humid climate. Accelerating and braking is the one thing that you try to avoid as much as you can, because that actually requires energy, and energy means sweating in Singapore. So what the Singaporean government has decided is by 2030 they want to be a cycling nation. Well, and they have identified that they need to build cycling facilities. Now the question is, can they get it right? And from the renderings I see at the moment, I must say yes and no. On the one hand, they plan fancy stuff, as you can see at the moment, for example, in Copenhagen, where they build bicycle bridges and so on. And so they do like good corridors. This bridge is actually an MRT line. And this is very helpful because it's shaded. Like you always want to be shaded in Singapore because the tropical sun really hits in. Certainly during the day, around midday. And it obviously helps to protect you from the torrential rain showers that are also typical for a tropical environment. Well, I personally obviously would say this actually should be wider because the pedestrians, there is no pedestrian demand, so one direction, other direction, and then you actually can also go with electric bicycles, which need a different curve radius as a normal bicyclist. You can go up to like 40 kilometers per hour. So this seems good, but then you see this. And then you really get to ask yourself, okay, what is exactly different to this situation? If you have a bicycle lane, okay, it's painted, but as soon as you come to a bus stop, the government is actually requiring you to dismount and push the bicycle across the bus stop. Will anybody do this? Probably no. If they enforce it, well, then people will do, or they won't do, because they just wouldn't cycle. So we felt we need a fresh approach to the topic, and something that's very convincing to say, look, I think it's great what you do with your 2030 plan, but maybe reconsider the design. So what we did is to come up with that research project. And the research project has basically 2 objectives. And one objective directly came as I was being approached at some point, Alex, by the government, and they asked me, Alex, can you tell me how many bicyclists we will have in 2030 if we do this? And I said, no, I can't, because I have no idea about how the Singapore population will react to all those design things. I first would need to study, and then obviously, the scientists always need to study and understand and can't give me the right numbers. And I said, well, I truly can't. I can kind of make up some numbers, cross-comparison to other cities, but truly it's difficult to come up with one number. So we said, to understand what's needed for cycling and walking and cycling to be considered as viable modes, this is one core research question, and then related to it, develop street designs that are responsive to future forms of mobility and understand what kind of behavior they trigger. And you can't build a street, even if you are very well funded in Singapore, you can't build a street in your lab. But you can build a street in virtual reality and rebuild it and redesign it and test it and get feedback and so on. And so that's the basic idea. So given that today we are those devices are available, such as the head-mounted display by Oculus or HTC Vive, and are pretty high fidelity, obviously they can always get better, we thought that's the right tool to test design and behavior for future street designs. So we started out about 1 year ago, hiring people, bringing the right people together. You need a rather broad set of skills to do so. And with the goal to study behavior by capturing the multisensory experience of walking and cycling. At the moment we are focusing on cycling. And multisensory, I mean, it's not just the visual, it's also the audio and what we then call the immersiveness, that you really feel you are into this new world or this new design. And the research question also then is actually what is required, how far you need to go, you need to develop those virtual reality environments that people feel this immersiveness. And the related question, do you actually get the results that you would observe in a field experiment, like with the actual environment, also with virtual reality. Now, how you set this up? First, you need a 3D model. And in the beginning, we were thinking, well, let's do this procedural, then it's all nice and parametric, and then you can kind of, in a fast-paced environment, come up with new designs, adapt them, and so on. So we decided to go for S3 City Engine. Then you need to, but as you know, in S3 City Engine, everything looks static. There is no dynamic. So we said, okay, as transport planners, we know the software in the field, state-of-the-art transport microsimulation, where you have hundreds or thousands of pedestrians, bicycles, buses and cars you can simulate with the appropriate acceleration, how they change lanes, brake in front of traffic lights, and so on. But the fidelity of the 3D rendering is pretty bad. And we need to bring it together with the output of the 3D engines. And this you do in software called Unity, which is a game engine. And then you can render out high-fidelity still images, you can render out videos, and you can play interactive virtual reality games for behavioral studies. So let's see what you can do with those things. So in the beginning, we started up with generating a virtual or imaginary block. This is like 1 by 1 kilometer about, where we particularly looked at how to generate street cross-sections by parametrizing the street. And so to generate those different pictures is just a question of like pulling the lever in City Engine and saying, by the way, I want to have a separator that is green, or I want to have a separator with trees. I want to have what number of lanes, how many cars on it, how many buses, and so on. So all what you can see is our parameterized streets. And the first step is then obviously to do like what we conventionally do in transport planning, to use pictures for behavioral surveys. So what we have done here is then to position the camera not like from the bird's perspective, but from the cyclist's perspective into those streets. In this situation, we faded out the surrounding, because at the moment we do not really know whether it's better to fade them out or keep them in, as if you keep them in, it actually might have an influence on your decision that is not particularly of interest to you at the moment. Because I'm not interested if there is a high rise, it affects your cycling behavior. I'm more interested, how do we design those streets, whether you would cycle or not. And so you can use those pictures in various ways. You can say, okay, please rank according how comfortable and safe you would feel. So you could maybe go 1, 2, 3. Or you say, consider you are cycling 6 minutes on this road or 2 minutes on this road, which route would you take? Or would you say, I wouldn't cycle it at all, would take another mode of transport? And those sort of surveys we will be conducting very soon with a web-based survey. But this is like what we always have done, just a bit nicer renderings. So we wanted to go one step further and really harness on the traffic microsimulation. As I said, the problem with traffic microsimulation is what it has been designed for is to evaluate various defined for intersections or a couple of intersections. And the software engineers have realized the better the visual fidelity, the easier it is actually to convince that the results you're generating with those simulation models are right. So they invested quite a bit in 3D modeling, but still if you compare it to what's possible with a virtual reality game engine, it's not good enough. So we wanted to go to have a better option. And obviously you can't combine the traffic microsimulation with the latest head-mounted displays. So what we did is then we take the information from the microsimulation, which is essentially X and Y coordinates of cars and buses and bicycles, into the game engine, and then you all of a sudden you realize, oh, I need to think about the traffic lights, I need to think about the wheels, that it doesn't look as the cars are just sliding, so the wheels need to turn. I only have every 10th of a second information about the location of the pedestrian or the buses and the cars. So I need to interpolate if I want to have 60 frames per second, and I want to have braking lights and. And then you suddenly become to realize virtual reality is an ugly beast, or reality is. So what really happened to me is I'm now much more aware of reality, working with virtual reality. So all the small little details that you need to consider to create reality is just tremendous. Anyway, at some point you need to also say, okay, let's be pragmatic, and then we also need a controller. Meaning in a gaming environment you have like your joystick, but what we want is immersiveness. So we, inspired by colleagues in the Netherlands, started up creating a virtual reality cycling simulator. So this you can consider just as a controller, as your joystick, but you can just sit on it and where you have mounted displays, and then you actually feel cycling, or hopefully would feel cycling through those streets. And after about 9 months of development, or 8, we had like a prototype where we felt it would be considerable to go out and do first survey experiment. We called it Bike to the Future, and it was also motivated by the fact that in Singapore you have a tremendously detailed 3D model of certain parts of the city. And so we picked one part of the city where we had the 3D model, and it also would be considerable to have a street design, and where on parking day, this is a special event on one day in the year, where you can take a public parking lot and do something else with it. Most people put some, I don't know, jumping castle or whatever on it, and we felt, there's a nice spot to get a bit of public attention, and we can conduct a survey experiment. And what we did is then to take 3 streets, so it's like a circuit parkour, and we redesigned it. So this is one street of our parkour that has been modeled in 3D. And that's not only, obviously, the color of the car, that's the same, the blue car, but as you see, so we have the trees and the buildings and even like those covered walkways from the Euro A. Euro A is the Urban Redevelopment Authority in Singapore. that's very much close to what's actually there. So those things are only possible if you have those 3D models. If you need to draw your 3D models on your own, you can't get there in a reasonable time. Oh, that's a pity. So let's jump to this then, and let's see what the people saw when they were riding through that virtual reality environment. Now I need to click on this, and now I have the problem that I don't see anything. Hang on. So where is my mouse? So maybe we start again. So now it's obviously only like 2D, so you can't turn your head around, but you can imagine how it would be. And now we have those sliders back and forth, how we designed and how the situation was before. Now all the pedestrians and the cars and obviously also the cyclists have been, that's for the first time, have been animated with this transport traffic micro simulation software. But essentially what we could provide at this moment was only a 360-degree video. So even if the cyclist like braked and accelerated or turned around on this cycling simulator, that did not change the speed or anything of the 360-degree video. So now we turn into the third segment, which at the moment is just like full of cars that want to get in this car park or want to park just ahead of your the shops. And now we said, okay, this is all car-free. There is more space for people and cyclists. And so we let the cyclists go through it. And as they were cycling, we did what's called a talk aloud interview. So they were asked to report what they see, how they feel, and so on. As this was actually the very parking spot where we set up our tent on parking day. And so they kind of started where they were in reality, did the tour, and got back, and then could take off the head-mounted display and helped us a bit with further question in the questionnaire. So this is how it looked like, and we had all kinds of people, young, old, not that many, women, men, all kinds of cultural backgrounds. And those are the survey results. So first of all, we realized, although this is a neighborhood with a fairly high amount of elderly people, it's very difficult to convince people above, let's say, 40 or 50 years old to wear a head-mounted display. There's too much of novelty for this. So this does not really represent kind of whom we asked, so we try to be as representative as possible with regards to whom we invite for the survey, but essentially the peak are clearly at 25. Luckily, we have about the same amount of women and men. Then, with regards, we had many Singaporeans, but also foreigners who are working in Singapore, a few tourists, so that's pretty representative. And then you can see like how often people cycle in Singapore, once per month, up to never, and like 4 to 6 times per year is the most frequent by far. So what people do is they go somewhere, rent a bicycle, do like a half-day tour, return it, and go back home. So it's not that they can't cycle, it's just that they don't feel like cycling given the street infrastructure in Singapore. So then kind of the punching line question, would you consider cycling along this road? And so before we put them on the bicycle stand and led them through the virtual reality cycling experience, we asked them, okay, look, this road, you know, because you are a visitor of this area, would you consider cycling along? And then 59% said yes, and then it gets trickier if you say, okay, but now you're with a 10-year-old, like your son, cousin, or whoever, and then they say 11% no. Say only 11% say yes. Now, we put them through, they experienced the new design, and this is what they say afterwards. So from 60% to 93%, they would consider cycling on their own. And then from 11, and that's even more interesting, to 74%, they would consider cycling with a 10-year-old. And this tells me two things. First, there is a huge problem with street design in Singapore for cyclists. And second, there is a huge opportunity to use virtual reality to test designs and behavioral reactions. Because obviously one would need to try and find a street that is as nicely designed as the Singapore Road in the future will be. But I could well imagine if you go to like Copenhagen or Amsterdam, you could get about those amount of kind of people who would consider cycling along a well-designed street. So at the moment we are continuing working on this. We have a very talented mechanical engineer, so you need all sorts of people to be able to do that, who is fitting or equipping our cycling simulator with all sorts of sensors so that you actually can steer, that you can accelerate, that your legs are in sync, because with the 360-degree head-mounted display you can do like this, and then if your legs don't do what you do on the virtual reality bicycle simulator is actually an odd thing. So we even have sensors at the pedals so that we know where the pedals are, and then you can relate where your legs are and link this through your head-mounted display. And we're also working at this integration of the micro-simulation so that essentially you can take over one agent and then all the other agents behave according to what you do. So if you brake, then the guy behind you brakes, and the pedestrian in front of you can actually cross the road. So those type of integrations. We call it the safety package, because with this we really want to see how different designs trigger different safety perceptions. Yes, please.
How long does it take to get to this fully interactive virtual reality?
I think fully interactive never will be, because at the moment, like the next real step would be a moving platform. Because if you accelerate, you would need to be like go like this. If you brake, you need to get in the front and then like tilting as well. But the next step should, so all the sensors are now ready. The next step is the integration, and we plan that by April we go with the next like behavioral study. And then the second stage would be comfort. Obviously in Singapore, it's also about like how strenuous it is to cycle, how far you can go, and how much would an electric rotor bring. So there we want to go even geekier and put some fans that are synced with your speed, so the faster you go, the more wind you can get. And this is not just like play around, this is really what, at least for me, was important. As long as you can cycle in Singapore, you get this wind that cools you down and it helps you a lot. Then e-bike, I also imported an e-bike to Singapore. That also helped me a lot because I was not sweating that much. Heat, sometimes you have those movable heat sources, or you have heat coming actually from the asphalt during the day, and that's radiation heat. There's not just that you can put people outside and say, okay, I have my outdoor lamp, but it's really a different form of heat perception. And sound actually has moved up here, because we think for the safety perception, you need to kind of really feel how it is if, say, a big bus is passing by. And a lot of this perception obviously depends on the noise that this bus makes. So I have 12 more minutes, which I will focus on a project that is now in kind of a bit in between phase, which is about engaging big data. There, some arrows are lacking, but let me quickly give you a brief explanation of what it is. So, a lot of effort has been put in transport planning into the modeling of those flows. So depending if you have like 20,000 people in Baselsdorf and 400,000 people in Zurich, you can guess how many people will travel from Baselsdorf to Zurich every morning. Now, the biggest problem with those models is not that you do not know about how many cars can pass the street between Zurich and Baselsdorf, because there are so many lanes and so on, but about knowing, do the people from Baselsdorf really go to Zurich, or rather do they go to Zurich-Altstetten or Zurich-Oerlikon? And with the development of mobile phone data, or like mobile phones, and everyone is carrying one, and actually the cell tower transactions, mobile phone companies know very well where people move in cities. Now, to get access to that data is rather difficult, but slowly the mobile phone companies see this as an asset and are opening their data boxes, at least for researchers at the moment. Now in Singapore, you have another source which is even better, which is the smart card data. So whenever you do a trip by public transport, you are being asked to swipe your card when you enter the vehicle or when you enter the MRT station, and swipe it again when you leave the MRT station or do a transfer. So knowing this data, you know exactly when and where people are traveling. And it's a tremendous source, obviously, also to run traffic simulations. Now, this is a different sort of traffic simulations. It's not about like generating realistic 3D renderings or videos. It's more about capturing the flow of 5 or 10 million people in a computer software. And what you can do with this software as compared to just have the data is you can do predictions. So you can do predictions in the sense, what if I add a new public transport line? Because if you have just the mobile phone data, just the smart card data, you never will be able to guess the ridership of this new line. You are able to guess the ridership on an average Friday, 5 o'clock, if it's sunny. Okay, this you can do like with what the data scientists call predictive analytics. But to do true what-if scenarios that include change of like the stocks and not just the flows, then you need a different source of tool. And we argue you need to combine big data with simulation to really have go from smart data to big data. Now in Singapore, as I said, we have those smart cards. It's about 96% of all the transactions. Now what you see is all based on one day. And it's combined with a very detailed picture of a travel supply, which basically is a public transport schedule, plus the schedule, we know how big the individual buses or MRT trains are, because you need this for running the simulation. Now this is the data as it comes in for one particular bus line, and the peaks are transactions, smart card transactions, and this the x-axis is time. So essentially what you try to do is to slice and dice it in a way that you say, okay, this is the stop, or the bus traveled to a stop, and then people were dwelling, boarding and alighting, and so on. And so you can clearly see this is a stop and this is a stop, but there is obviously a bit of like smartness in it, how you can slice and dice it according to this data, because people are tapping out early, so the bus is still moving, but you already can swipe your card. People are getting into the bus, and where is my card? The bus has already departed, and then you swipe your card. And you need, in an automated way, filter out the data so that you actually can understand when was the bus traveling and when was it stopping. Then those buses are obviously sometimes moving along the same corridors, and sometimes are the only buses along one street, as in this example. And what you can do here then is to simplify this model by saying, I'm actually not so interested how many links there are in between, but I just say, okay, this is a stop, so at what we call dwell link, so how much time it takes to get people on and off board bus, and how much time it takes from one stop to another. And obviously, there's time it takes, you need to explain by what type of bus it is, how many people get into the bus, get out of the bus, how many people are already in the bus, because the more people are in, the actually longer it takes to get people in and out. And for the stretches in between bus stops, is there a bus lane, how many red lights there are, how much activity is going on in this area, and so on. And so the basic principle of that model was that anything that we need to estimate those distribution comes directly from the smart card. So we only need this one data source. Then obviously the question is, okay, how precise or accurate can you be with such a model that's only based on smart card data. And this is a time-space time graph that we have derived from the smart card data. So each line you see is essentially one bus service that starts here, and then as time passes can move up the line, and you see those steps. Those are stops where the bus is standing, so the time continues, but they can't go further up because people need to get on and off board. And so this is across a day, and now you see the same pattern as we have simulated it. And it looks pretty much the same. So the speeds are automatically calibrated. We have the same amount of bus bunching, which means that although the buses start in almost equal intervals at the start-stop, because there are some disturbances along the way, you get those situations where you have two buses of the same line just next to each other and then a huge gap in behind, such as here. You see they start at the same time, and then something happens with this bus. This one is too fast, this one is too slow. You have a huge gap behind. Obviously, then people accumulate at the bus stop, which slow down where it is, the next bus, and so on, and then you have the bus bunching, and you have huge gaps, service gaps in between. Now the question is, what can you use such a simulation for? And is exactly to come up with new designs that address this reliability issue. Now a bit more validation, how accurate you can be. So we have two types of distribution. In black here we see the simulation, and then in gray what we directly obtain from the smart card. We have the travel time of being in a bus simulated as compared to smart card on the left, and then we have the headway distribution, so the time between two subsequent buses. And all in all, you can see that our simulation gives you a pretty accurate representation of the observations as well. Also with regards to trip travel time, which makes us confident that actually the results we are producing are relevant. And if we can reliably regenerate what is being observed today, it's then the claim that you also can change the system and in a reliable manner test future design configurations. And this is essentially then one of the case study applications. In Singapore, you have, for historic reasons, bus lines that go up to 90 stops, 40 kilometers in one direction, and take the bus driver about 2 hours. Now, those very long bus lines are very prone to be unreliable, because all of a sudden something happens, 4 people forget their smart cards or can't find them, there is a traffic light, and all of a sudden you are too slow, the bus behind catches up, and then you have those reliability issues. So what we wanted to show is that actually you need to redesign your bus network to be able to have a higher service quality, less bus bunching, and more reliable bus services. Now, this you only can really, in such a manner, show if you have a dynamic simulation system and if you have very good information about the demand. Otherwise, you would have too many unknown factors and would not be able to reliably test this. I'm again searching for my mouse. Here I have it. To play the video. So what you see is each moving dot represents one individual bus. If it's red, it's stopping. If it's blue, it's traveling. And what you can see is that, especially in the second half of the line, you have those circles, which mean 2 buses are traveling next to each other. And then behind, you have huge gaps where no bus is coming. So you have what we call excess waiting time, so more waiting time than the average frequency. And then what we tested is, okay, let's do something simple. Let's split the line almost in the middle, and then rerun the simulation and just look what happens with regards to travel time, waiting time, and so on. And the results were pretty solid. So 60% waiting time reduction, travel time reduction, 11 minutes. Obviously, people are coming from other lines because this line becomes more reliable. But Some people also actually switch away because they want to avoid a transfer. But all in all, the ridership did not go down, which is always a concern. If you split the bus line, people are getting upset. But people are actually saving time. So the idea is, and this is something you could not do before, is to really also test future bus networks with regards to reliability using such a transport simulation. And with this, at the end of the presentation, we have 1 minute for your questions, or a bit more, if Gerhard allows.
Thank you. Yeah, we're way over time already, but maybe there's one question that you want to ask because you're interested in that. Go ahead.
It's just like at the end, you showed the same thing with 4 different lanes. Is there a gain as well, or is it better to just split into 2?
We haven't tested it with a complete redesign. So far, we only did the split. But it's more to show that you could test a complete redesign with such a simulation software.
Very good. One other question? Not so. It was very good, very deep, and I think you all realized that it's not enough just to put signals and sensors and things like that to make a city smart, to make a transportation smart, but there's a lot of thinking that people have to bring into the design and the redesign of the neighborhood that makes it safer and more attractive for bicycle riding, for example, as you could very nicely demonstrate with that. And this is something we can take from here. There was an article in last Sunday's Time, the NZZ, basically making fun of Bern because they add in bicycle lanes or thinking about a bicycle bridge, while Zurich and Basel are so progressive that they're adding high rises. And if you think about it in this context, I think you have second thoughts on.
It almost needs a comment on that.
So very good. Thank you very much, and see you again next Monday, second last one. And there we make then the step from the smart city to the responsive city. Have a great week. Thank you.